I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm excited to be joined by Lucy Boynton to talk all about her role in A Cruel Love, the Ruth Ellis story. And one of the first things that I was really interested in is there's so many elements in terms of this story and Ruth's experience, which permeate into the specific time period at which this story happened and at which she went through all these experiences. And there's so many elements in terms of who she is as a character and the way that she's perceived and received in the world throughout. And I was interested in how that led into your character development process in really thinking very specifically about all of that.
It's such a good point, and it's so interesting to understand that there's such a separation between someone's public identity, especially at that time. She did not have her own voice, so she was very much at the mercy of how the media were deciding to portray her. So to identify that there is such a difference between that Ruth Ellis and the Ruth Ellis who her people knew her to be and who she knew herself to be. And so I don't even think I didn't know what that scope would be, like how close that margin would be or how expansive. And so it was a really interesting part of the research process. And I think so, as you mentioned, so informed by that era and the 1950s. I mean, Carol Ann's book, which this is based on, was my Bible throughout this because she gives such a detailed understanding of the impact of the 1950s, especially on women in post-war London, where their role was kind of reduced again, having been such an integral part of the war effort. Their role was reduced again to just staying within the confines of the home. And Ruth just wanted so much more for herself. So she in herself was a kind of rebellion against the expectations of that era. She wanted to be a successful businesswoman. She wanted to be financially independent. And all of these elements that just weren't obviously detailed about her at all. So I started to get a much better understanding of just how much integrity she had when your very existence and your aspirations for yourself are a rebellion, are a kind of a rebellion against everything that you're told that you can be, and you kind of have to forge space for yourself. Sorry, that's my thesis, just the beginning. I feel like there's so much to say about her that I'm just like, any opportunity, I'm like, let's go.
No, I love it because there's so many details to unpack. And even with what you were just describing about the ambition, what I think is so interesting is that it was so seeded in her from such a young age. You know, she'd been working since she was 14 years old and always had ambitions kind of beyond the life that she grew up in. And I was interested with that, you know, how much you kind of dug into like her younger life and her younger self. And, you know, again, to your point, there's a lot that wasn't necessarily covered when she was written about. So was there even material to dive into, or was it more self-creation on that side?
Again, I credit Carol Ann for the in-depth and the scope of research that she has detailed in that book because it digs in a lot to Ruth's childhood, and a lot of that is based on interviews. I mean, her sister wrote a book about their childhood as well, which details a lot of the trauma that they were both put through by their father. And so I think all of that is so integral in understanding everything that shaped Ruth. And I think such a fundamental part of her is that she is not at all self-pitying. She is very pragmatic and incredibly hardened. And when you understand her background, her childhood, and the context she grew up in, so she was 14 in London during the Blitz. So she would walk to work and see bodies and corpses on the side of the road. I mean, her father was horrifically abusive to her and her sister. So she, from a very young age, thought that that's what men were like, didn't know to expect anything else. So once you start to realize how much life she has been put through in such a short space of time and as such a young person, I think you do have more empathy and understanding for why she was as kind of hardened and pragmatic as she was.
And it comes across in the series that she also had a real understanding of how she was perceived by the world in different settings, you know. So there's a very different version to her when she's working in the club and she kind of knows who she needs to be in that setting to who she thinks and knows she needs to be in the courtroom to be perceived in a certain way. And I was interested in how that kind of shaped your approach to playing the character and not just thinking about how she's responding to situations, but how she's behaving based on perception.
That's the thing that makes her so interesting as well, because um She's so smart in terms of her understanding of the chessboard that society is. So she knew how to present in order to be accepted by different demographics and different echelons of society. And she affected different selves to kind of to shape shift between that. And I think um she was so perceptive in that manner, which is integral to the job that she had. So I think that's why she was able to be so successful in it. But it also indicates that she had a clear understanding of, as you said, the way the public viewed her. So I keep saying that she had 28 years of experience of this society, of knowing how she was deemed based on her class and her gender. So that's why in the court scenes you get such a limited view of her, because she knew exactly how it was going to play out. So she gave very little of herself. Whereas in the little club where you see her operating to her full scope, she knows that she can be the more magnetic and brighter, more effervescent version of herself. And I think that also speaks to the class system in the UK at the time, where she did everything she could, changed her voice, changed her hair and appearance to be accepted by them. And nothing she could do was enough. It's a closed door society. We in the UK, I think, are very precious about upholding this kind of strict hierarchy of class. Um, and it was, yeah, it was something that she was just kind of barred from. That was a really brutal element to research.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask about some of the dynamic in terms of the relationships that she has throughout the series with Desmond and with David, because, it kind of feels like Desmond's the person that logically, she's kind of drawn to, and then David's the person that she has the chemistry and like that charisma and just like that magneticism with. It's kind of like the heart versus the brain. And I was interested in how you feel like there were two different sides of her that came out in each of those relationships as well.
Yeah, and I think our instinct is to try and analyze that relationship with David Blakely and understand why she stayed, why she kept going back. And I think as soon as we started filming those scenes and seeing Laurie Davidson bring Blakely to life, I understood it so much better of something that can't be analytically approached. It is that chemistry, it is that chemical thing that draws you to a person that is more dangerous, I think, when you can't articulate what exactly it is. It just is. Um, and there are elements obviously that you can, which is that she was such a novelty to him, and he was, of a part of the world, like of the society that she wanted to be accepted into. So there was so much validity that came with kind of his acceptance and kind of um, appeal of her. Um, and so it was interesting, yeah, kind of living a version of that. And then with Desmond, who you do think is this kind of safe kind of raft from everything, where you do think he's so promising, and then he turns out to be one of the most destructive of all. And I think it's heartbreaking that kind of everywhere she turned, every man let her down and kind of wanted something from her that was a projection onto her rather than just seeing her for who she was.
And even with what you're describing with her relationship with David, so much of it again feeds back into what you were describing about the relationship she's had in the past. There's a point where she's talking about how every time she'd been in an abusive relationship, everyone would say, "Well, what did you do to make him do these things?" rather than blaming the man. And so, how did you want to kind of take that lens and that perception that she'd created of herself at that point into a lot of the reason why these cycles continued with David in their relationship?
Yeah, that's the most heartbreaking element. Women are three times more likely to be arrested for domestic violence, even though men are the primary cause of it. Men are 97% of the source of domestic violence. And therefore, I think so much of it comes from the perception of her that she is a unapologetic, loud force of a person. I mean, she was also like 5'2" and 90 pounds, but she took up space and carved out space for herself. And therefore, there is this misconstrued idea that someone who is strong in themselves can't be at the mercy of something, can't be victim to something, can't be taken advantage of. And so I kind of, and also just in how she identified, she didn't have the context that we as outsiders have for her life. So she didn't know that she deserved so much better than that she was as much as she hated being considered as such, victim to so much. And so she had much less patience for herself and kind of an empathy for herself than we as external voyeurs and viewers can see that she deserved. And so even though she knew by the end, I think that she didn't deserve the result that she was kind of condemned to, we have a much clearer understanding of the sheer scope of that injustice. And I think the media have a huge responsibility in how that was relayed to the public, presenting her as this kind of villainess, that what she had done was cold-blooded and that she put up as much of a fight. And she kind of said that herself. I think she was conditioned to believe that also, that because she sometimes fought back, she was therefore also culpable. And thankfully we have, I mean, it was known at the time. A broad scope of the public knew at the time what an injustice this was. But we thankfully have a contemporary understanding for just the sheer imbalance of kind of fairness in this case. And that it comes down to that I think that had Blakely ever been held accountable for any of his actions, there would be no Ruth Ellis case to talk about.
Mhm. And I think it also explores the kind of manipulation that he creates within the relationship. You know, the first time that we see him on screen abusive towards her, the next scene is the fact that she's comforting him and he's the one crying, and he kind of turns himself into the victim. And you know, I was just interested in kind of like how you found the writing to really capture the emotional manipulation being just as strong as the physical side of things.
Which I think is so integral to understanding that dynamic, because so much of their relationship was determined, or like the outcome of her life was determined by an external perception with of which he was very good at presenting a certain way, even though that kind of was penetrated often. I mean, there are so many interviews in Carol Ann's book with race car drivers that he worked with, who said the same, that he had a terrible temper, that he was very kind of childish and stroppy and at the mercy of his own feelings, quite erratic. Um, but the kind of general consensus was because he was part of this upper echelon of society, he was just gifted the assumption of innocence, the assumption of elegance and superiority and education. Um, and so it was excruciating to read, and kind of sickening to do those scenes where you realize the contrast between what is happening behind closed doors and what people just aren't privy to. And again, I feel very lucky to be a part of this series which does shed light on that, because prior to this, there is very little understanding of what actually happened. Very little was made public to audiences, to the general public. So I hope this does give a kind of a better understanding of what can be happening outside of your reach of view, of scope. Yeah, and I think Kelly, our writer, struck such a kind of measured and beautiful balance between those elements that convey him being incredibly charming and so kind. So you really understand what pulls people to him. And then those moments of cruelty, which I also credit so much to Laurie for finding those moments that only I could notice being on the receiving end of, or the audience can pick up on because they're so nuanced, but the kind of the cut is so specific and deep. And it is those microaggressions and small kind of idiosyncrasies that can so dislodge someone's confidence and assurance of their own opinion of this person and themselves. I think it can just really discombobulate you when everyone else is seeing a different side of you.
Yeah, and even with what you just brought up about the way that it changes her perception of herself and her self-confidence, you know, it goes back to what you were describing earlier in terms of this was someone who was very charismatic, very vivacious, very ambitious in the world, and you see some of that light disappear a little bit. And so I was interested in what were some of the shifts and the changes that you kind of perceived in the character from the experience of her own self-perception changing so drastically.
It's such a good question. I think those are the moments where, prior to meeting him, even though she had been through so much, she still has a sense of belief in herself and her capability and what she deserves. She was a very pragmatic businesswoman, And that's why she was able to be financially independent and successful. And I think when you meet someone who starts to erode you, you just start to lose touch with those parts of yourself that are willing to take up space. And so you do start to see that in the series. And I kind of tried to find a lot of those moments where she's just not able to reach out or take up as space anymore, because you lose your I don't want to say worth in a way, but it kind of is. It's like you lose the faith that you deserve to take up that much space. You lose the sense of confidence in yourself and your surroundings, because you are being told, you are being denied your experience. You think that you are existing in something and living through something, and then you're told it's kind of it's made up, or that you're just completely misinterpreting it. So you lose a bit of trust in yourself, I think. And when you have no one else to bounce that off of, or she kind of can't accept or can't afford to accept what her friends are telling her about Blakely, you do, as you said, you kind of start to see that light dim. And he cost her so much. I mean, she was she was thriving. She had her own, I mean, we detail it in the series where she had her own apartment. She was financially independent, which for a woman at that time was remarkable. She was the youngest club manager in London, which again, for a woman at that time was remarkable. She wasn't given that space. She absolutely carved it out for herself. And she lost it all because of him. He eroded her finances. He lived off of her, and had her, resulted in her being fired. And it just, everything that you attach your sense of identity to was then kind of stripped away. So yeah, it's kind of, it was devastating to read about.
And there's such a stark contrast in terms of how we see her at the beginning and then how we see her after she's been arrested. And there's such like a stillness and a stoicness. And it kind of felt like some of that did come from the idea of this is how I need to behave right now, but also that it was still processing the trauma and like not necessarily having the words to describe what she'd gone through. And I was curious kind of like how you shaped that side of the performance, because it's very different to the earlier scenes.
That I think was a really interesting exercise in challenging our perception of what a victim looks like. Because in those moments, she argued that it was a completely conscious decision. She knew that she had to do this and wanted to do this. So I think in those scenes, she is kind of fully accepting of what she was going to do, and is now dealing with the second to second repercussion of having done it. We're now living in the post aftermath of what has become. I think there is now, in those moments, a tremendous sense of relief. He can never hurt her, harm her, come near her again. There is a weight lifted, that tumultuous existence and torture is over. And in those scenes, I was trying to play it mindful of that's all that you can accept. That's all you can afford to think about in this moment. Because if you even slightly pull the thread of thought of really what she's done, the fact that he is dead, and the implications on her son, she can't afford to. So she has to hone in and put a spotlight on what she can afford to focus on. And so those moments in the cell and being interviewed are just about containment, about clutching to this moment in time and just keeping it together. Yeah, it was a fascinating scene as an actor to approach, and a kind of devastating uh, investigation into a person who is experiencing that, which was the kind of the experience throughout filming. On one hand, it's really interesting from a psychological perspective, and on the other, it is completely devastating and gut-wrenching to know that you are just chipping away at this real lived experience from someone, yeah, of someone's life.
It is, and there's also the element of there being people around her who are trying to convince her to have hope that maybe we can change the outcome and maybe something different could happen. Did you think that the fact that she doesn't want to think that way kind of goes back to being very pragmatic in the way that she's thinking about, like, it's easier to just go, this is the outcome, this is what's happening, and I can focus on that and I can be in control of like how I go through this, versus trying to rely on something that might never happen, especially with how she's been treated by the world up to that point.
That's a really great question. I think it's both. And I also think it's just the context of that era where we did not have an understanding of the implication and repercussions of domestic violence. So there was no respect for it. So she didn't have any context that could contribute to diminished responsibility because of provocation, because she was reacting to something that was being done to her. And so there was, as an outsider, I kind of see it as I don't want to sound crude, but like a kind of lack of self-worth because she didn't think she deserved to be empathized with. She thought, I have killed him and I deserve the full weight of punishment for that. She took full responsibility for her actions, which I think really threw people off. She was very sober about admitting what she did and that she wanted to do it. And taking kind of full accountability of that, which was, I think, was very rare to see. Um, but yeah, I think it was mostly not to take kind of authority from her, but I think it is a lack of context. And I think it is everything that she had been at the mercy of. She really genuinely thought that she deserved this punishment. And when she starts to let it in that perhaps she doesn't, again, I think it is such a monolith to digest. It's almost too much to deal with. And so it was such a complex sequence of unraveling emotions and unraveling understanding. Yeah, it was, and again, just to be reminded that she was only 28 when going through all of this was, yeah, devastating.
Yeah, and there's a lot at play with Toby Jones's character who's playing her solicitor through all of this. And there's a conversation that the two of them have at one point where she's basically saying, I've always been treated this way by men, and this is the first time that I've thought maybe I didn't deserve this. What was kind of that unraveling that you were touching upon, that you kind of really found in just how she really shifted her opinion of what she deserved in the world and what should have been different?
I think, again, she took a very pragmatic approach to that. That was, I mean, I cried when I first read that speech in the script. Um, it's the first time she's, again, kind of, I don't know how to articulate it, but like kind of given this gift of context and of empathy. She has been dealt such an awful hand in the way that she has been treated right from childhood. And she's given this kind of clarity that perhaps confirms what she's always felt, that she does have worth and value as a person, but which she has really had to self-source, self-generate that feeling because the world was telling her the antithesis. And so this is a gift of confirmation of that. Um, and so there is a calm to that scene of, I see now. I see the full picture now. Which again, from an outside perspective, was just devastating to investigate and to kind of and to deliver. Um, and again, it's indicative of her intelligence and perceptiveness of the full scope, the full chessboard, where she just calls Bickford out and she sees him for not the kind of game he's playing and the mercy that he is at of these like bureaucratic suits. And she has understood before him and better than him that they are so at the mercy of a machine in play and that it is not a fair landscape. I mean, as he tells her too, uh, there is no kind of fair rule system to this. You are at the mercy of social politics and class politics and gender politics. And um, yeah, I think it's an emotional moment when she finally, despite knowing all of that, just has a glimmer of hope that perhaps there is a chance that she is, for the first time in her life, kind of served justice and treated with respect. And obviously, as a viewer and as, you know, the actor playing her, I you find yourself hoping that there is a different outcome as much as you know that's a fool's errand and you know that there was the outcome that was. It's just so unfair.
Yeah, and I mean, she talks a lot about how she'd rather people think that she's a cold-blooded, heartless killer than to feel pity for her or sympathy for her. And it's interesting watching the scenes in court where she has to sit there and kind of listen to the way that people are describing her. And what was your experience in terms of filming those scenes? Because again, it's like you can't kind of give these big responses or reactions, and it's not about the dialogue, but just the way that she's kind of taking in and just hearing all of these different opinions and voices about her around herself.
It was sickening. Sitting there as a contemporary person, seeing this through a contemporary lens, the fury you feel having to listen. I mean, the jury are men, the courtroom is full of men. They've all made their mind up about who and how she is. And then you have psychologists coming in and talking about female hysteria when every man in her life has been at the mercy of his feelings, has been so volatile and erratic and violent as a repercussion of that. To be told that it is gender specific when you know your experience is the opposite throughout your life and our collective understanding is evidence of the opposite, it was maddening that that was taken as fact. And I can't imagine the rage that you must feel. I mean, I guess it's through the contemporary lens that I feel more rage because that was just kind of life at the time. That was how women were seen and treated and viewed. Um, and it's so hard to articulate. I think she did such a remarkable job of acknowledging that, acknowledging the limitations that life was and society specifically was trying to press upon her and working within that frame against it, playing them at their own game, finding the spaces that she could carve out for herself, finding the kind of loopholes or the cracks in the framework to succeed. Um, and so actually perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps it was much more infuriating for me kind of on her behalf, feeling so in frustrated and desperate for it to be different. Whereas for her, it would have come as no surprise. That is the world that she lived in. That is, like I said, she had 28 years of experience of exactly that. She called it before it happened. But yeah, it was agony.
Yeah. I feel like you have so many interesting insights and kind of thoughts on this. And I appreciate everything that you just kind of articulated about the character and about the series. So congratulations and thank you so much for such a lovely conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.